Case 1, Amy Hebert. August 20th, 2007. Matthews, Lafourche Parish, Louisiana. There is a particular kind of case that true crime storytellers approach with hesitation, not because the facts are unclear, but because they are almost too painful to sit with. This is one of those cases. It is the story of a mother, a marriage that fell apart, and two children who never had the chance to grow up. To understand what happened in Matthews, Louisiana, on that August night, you have to understand the year that preceded it. Amy Hebert, née Talbot, and her husband, Chad Hebert, were in the process of a divorce, and by every account that would later surface in court, it was not a quiet or amicable one. Divorces involving children rarely are. Custody negotiations, financial disputes, and the slow unraveling of a shared life can turn even reasonable people bitter. But somewhere in the middle of that process, something in Amy Hebert shifted from bitterness into something far more dangerous. Investigators and prosecutors would later argue that Amy's anger toward Chad became so consuming, so singularly focused, that she began to see her own children not as people to protect, but as instruments, the one thing she could take from her husband that he could never get back. It is one of the most disturbing dynamics that exists in family violence. A parent weaponizing a child's life not out of impulse, but out of calculated intent to inflict maximum pain on someone else. Camille Hebert was 9 years old. Braxton Hebert was 7. By every measure, they were simply children, living in a home that, from the outside, likely looked no different from any other going through a difficult custody transition. Nothing about their ages, their innocence, or their circumstances marked them as anything other than kids caught in the middle of their parents' separation, the way millions of children are every year. On the night of August 20th, 2007, in the small, quiet community of Matthews, a town so unassuming that few outside Lafourche Parish had ever heard its name before this case, Amy Hebert carried out an attack on her own son and daughter as they slept. Both children were stabbed dozens of times. The violence of the attack, investigators later noted, reflected not a single moment of loss of control, but a sustained, deliberate act. In the hours that followed, Amy also killed the family dog and turned a knife on her own body, inflicting multiple wounds to her torso, neck, and wrists. Whether this was a genuine attempt to end her own life, or a staged element meant to shape how the scene would later be interpreted, became one of the central questions of the case. Self-inflicted wounds in the aftermath of a family homicide are notoriously difficult for investigators to read. They can indicate authentic despair. They can also indicate an attempt to control the narrative before anyone else has the chance to. For a period of time, none of this was visible to the outside world. The Hebert home sat quiet. It was an ordinary, almost mundane detail that finally broke the silence. Camille and Braxton were scheduled to be picked up by their father, Chad, as part of the custody arrangement that had defined their lives for months. When the children didn't arrive and no one answered at the house, Chad did what any parent in that position would do. He raised the alarm and asked law enforcement to check on his children's welfare. That single, ordinary act, a welfare check, the kind performed by patrol officers across the country every day for far less dire reasons, led investigators into a scene that would shape the rest of their careers. It is impossible to overstate how difficult these calls are for the officers who respond to them. Behind every headline in a case like this is a first responder who had to process, in real time, the worst thing they may ever see in their career. The investigation that followed moved quickly. There was no external intruder to search for, no ambiguous suspect pool. The evidence pointed inward, to the children's mother, and Amy Hebert was taken into custody. What followed was a legal process that would stretch on for nearly 2 years, as prosecutors built a case for first-degree murder, and Amy's defense team began constructing a very different narrative. At trial, Amy Hebert's attorneys entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. Under Louisiana law, this is one of the most difficult defenses to successfully mount. The defendant must show not simply that they suffered from a mental illness, but that the illness rendered them unable to distinguish right from wrong at the moment of the offense. Amy's defense team argued she was in the grip of severe psychotic depression, a condition serious enough, they claimed, to have fundamentally distorted her perception of reality on the night of the killings. It's worth pausing here to say something about how the justice system treats insanity defenses. because they are widely misunderstood. Contrary to popular belief, insanity pleas are rarely successful. Some studies estimate they succeed in less than 1% of felony cases nationally, and when they are raised, juries and prosecutors scrutinize them intensely. The burden isn't simply proving mental illness exists. It's proving that illness eliminated the defendant's capacity for intent. And it was intent that the prosecution zeroed in on. Rather than relying solely on the physical evidence from the scene, prosecutors introduced something that would prove devastating to the defense's argument: suicide notes written by Amy Hebert in her own hand. In them, according to court proceedings, she explicitly placed blame for what had happened on her ex-husband, Chad. To the jury, these were not the disjointed, incoherent writings of someone who had lost all touch with reality. They were coherent. They were directed. They articulated a grievance and assigned responsibility for the violence to a specific person for a specific reason. That distinction between genuine psychosis and profound, focused rage became the crux of the trial. In 2009, a Lafourche Parish jury delivered its verdict: guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The jury had rejected the insanity defense, concluding that Amy Hebert understood the nature of her actions when she carried them out. Because the charges were first-degree murder, Louisiana law made the death penalty a possible sentence, and prosecutors pursued it. But Louisiana, like most states with capital punishment, requires that a jury reach a unanimous decision to impose a death sentence. In Amy Hebert's case, the jury could not reach that unanimous agreement. Under state law, when a capital jury deadlocks on sentencing, the result is automatic: a sentence of life imprisonment. Amy Hebert received 2 consecutive life terms, without the possibility of parole, meaning she will spend the entirety of her natural life in a Louisiana correctional facility, with no eligibility for release. In the years since, the case has occasionally resurfaced in discussions about family court systems, custody evaluations, and the warning signs that sometimes precede family violence. It is exceptionally rare for a parent's anger toward an estranged spouse to escalate into violence against their own children, but when it does, the aftermath ripples far beyond the immediate family. Extended relatives, school communities, and entire towns are left to process a tragedy that defies easy explanation. Camille and Braxton Hebert did not get to finish growing up. They didn't get to see what kind of adults they might have become. Their story stands as a somber reminder that the warning signs of escalating family conflict deserve to be taken seriously by courts, by counselors, and by the people closest to a family in crisis. If you are a parent going through a difficult separation and you feel that anger, yours or someone else's, is spiraling beyond what feels manageable, please know that help exists. The National Domestic Violence Hotline and local child advocacy centers across Louisiana and the country are available to support families before a situation reaches a breaking point. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 2, Victoria Cox. June, 2024. Loranger, Tangipahoa Parish, Louisiana. Not every person who stands trial for a horrific crime pulled the trigger, swung the weapon, or made the first fatal decision. Sometimes, the story is about what a person chooses to do after, the moment they learn the truth about someone close to them, and decide to become part of what comes next anyway. This is the story of Victoria Cox. In June of 2024, a crime that began in a quiet corner of Tangipahoa Parish would end up spanning 2 states, involve federal law enforcement, and ultimately raise painful questions about complicity, loyalty, and the choices people make when someone they've known since childhood does the unthinkable. It started in Loranger, Louisiana, a small, close-knit community northwest of New Orleans. Daniel Callahan took the life of 35-year-old Callie Brunette inside her own home, a place that should have been the safest space in the world for her and her daughters. In the chaos that followed, Callahan abducted Callie's 2 young girls, 6-year-old Jaylee and 4-year-old Erin. For the family, and for investigators, the hours and days after an abduction like this are almost unbearably tense. Every passing hour without information narrows the window in which a missing child can be found safe. Law enforcement across jurisdictions began mobilizing, aware that time was the single most critical factor in the case. It was into this unfolding crisis that Victoria Cox entered. Cox was a mother of 3 children of her own, and she had known Daniel Callahan since childhood, the kind of long, familiar friendship that, under different circumstances, would have no bearing on a criminal investigation at all. But investigators would later determine that the day after Callie Brunett's death, Cox traveled to Louisiana and joined Callahan. According to the case record, she did so fully aware of what he had done. What makes this case particularly difficult to reckon with is not just what Cox allegedly knew, but what she chose to do next. Rather than contacting law enforcement, rather than using the knowledge she had to help save 2 little girls, she traveled with Callahan across state lines, away from Louisiana and into a remote, heavily wooded area outside Jackson, Mississippi. It was a decision that removed the children even further from the reach of the investigators searching for them, and one that would ultimately expose her to some of the most serious charges a person can face in the American legal system. What happened to Jaylee and Aaron Brunette in the days that followed is difficult to recount, and it's difficult to hear, but it deserves to be told honestly, because minimizing it would do a disservice to what these 2 children endured. According to the investigation, both suspects subjected 6-year-old Jaylee to sustained physical and sexual abuse during the time the children were held. 4-year-old Aaron did not survive. She was killed by asphyxiation. In an act that underscores just how much both children were failed by the adults responsible for their safety, the girls were concealed beneath a mattress in a roadside ditch. Jaylee, alive and only 6 years old, was forced to remain there beside her sister's body until help finally arrived. That help came from a coordinated cross-jurisdictional effort involving U.S. Marshals and local Mississippi law enforcement, working alongside Louisiana investigators who had been tracking the case since Callie Brunette's death. Cases that cross state lines require an extraordinary level of cooperation between agencies that don't always share resources, databases, or jurisdiction, and the successful location of Jaylee Brunette stands as a testament to what that cooperation can accomplish, even under the worst possible circumstances. When Victoria Cox was ultimately taken into custody, she faced an extraordinarily serious set of charges. Because the case involved capital murder and sexual battery indictments, Cox was, at least theoretically, facing the possibility of the death penalty, the most severe consequence available under Mississippi and Louisiana law. Facing that reality, she made the decision to cooperate with investigators and negotiate plea agreements in both jurisdictions, a path that would ultimately spare her life, but not her freedom. In Mississippi, where the abduction and the crimes against the children took place, Cox pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and kidnapping. She received a 40-year sentence, alongside a concurrent 25-year term for the kidnapping charge, meaning the 2 sentences would run at the same time rather than stacking on top of one another. In Louisiana, where the case had originated with Callie Brunette's death, Cox pleaded guilty to reduced charges, obstruction of justice, and attempted aggravated kidnapping. These charges reflected her role in the earlier stages of the crime, her presence in Louisiana in the immediate aftermath, and her decision to leave the state with Callahan rather than alert authorities. On April 30, 2026, a Louisiana judge delivered her sentence for those charges, 60 consecutive years in prison. When combined with her sentence out of Mississippi, the practical result is that Victoria Cox will spend the overwhelming majority of the rest of her natural life behind bars, even without a death sentence or a single life without parole conviction on her record. It's worth reflecting, for a moment, on what this case represents beyond its individual facts. Cases involving child abduction that cross state lines are among the most resource-intensive and time-sensitive investigations that law enforcement handles. The involvement of the U.S. Marshals Service, an agency more commonly associated with fugitive recovery than child recovery, reflects just how seriously federal authorities treated the search for Jaylee and Aaron Brunette once the case crossed into Mississippi. And at the center of it all is Jaylee Brunette, a 6-year-old girl who survived an ordeal that no child or adult should ever have to endure. Her survival doesn't erase what was taken from her, but it stands as a powerful testament to the investigators who refused to stop searching and to her own resilience in the face of unimaginable circumstances. Cases like this one are part of why organizations such as the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children exist, providing law enforcement with the tools, technology, and coordination needed to bring abducted children home, and offering resources to families navigating the aftermath of these tragedies. If this case affected you, consider supporting a child advocacy organization in your own community or familiarizing yourself with the resources available should you ever find yourself needing them. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 3. Kayla Giles. September 8, 2018. Alexandria, Rapides Parish, Louisiana. Some of the most difficult true crime cases to sit with aren't the ones involving strangers in the dark or premeditated plots carried out over months. They're the ones that unfold in broad daylight, in public places, in front of the very children whose safety was supposedly the reason for the confrontation in the first place. This is the story of Kayla Giles, a case that would wind its way through the Louisiana courts for nearly 8 years, raising uncomfortable questions about self-defense law, custody disputes, and what happens when a legal doctrine designed to protect people collides with a killing that a jury ultimately didn't believe was justified. To understand what happened in that Walmart parking lot in Alexandria, you have to understand the backdrop against which it occurred. Kayla Giles and Thomas Cootie Jr. were locked in what family court professionals often describe as one of the most emotionally volatile situations a co-parenting relationship can produce. A custody arrangement between two people who could no longer be in the same room without conflict, but who were nonetheless bound together indefinitely by the children they shared. Custody exchanges, the moment when a child physically moves from one parent's care to the other's, are widely recognized by family law professionals as one of the highest risk moments in a contentious separation. It's why many family courts mandate that these exchanges take place in neutral, public locations, precisely because parking lots of grocery stores, police station lobbies, and retail centers are considered safer than either parent's private residence. The logic is sound in theory. Witnesses, security cameras, and public visibility are supposed to discourage confrontation. In this case, that same public setting would instead become the location of a killing witnessed, at least in part, by the very children the exchange was meant to protect. The date of the exchange carried its own painful irony. September 8, 2018, was the second birthday of Kayla and Thomas's daughter, a day that, under any other circumstances, would have been marked by celebration, not tragedy. Instead, in the middle of a routine handoff in a crowded Walmart parking lot, the encounter between Kayla Giles and Thomas Cootie Jr. escalated into violence. Amid a heated confrontation, Giles produced a concealed handgun and fired a single shot into Cootie's chest. He died as a result of that gunshot wound, in front of the children who were there for what should have been an ordinary custody transfer. In the aftermath, Giles did not deny that she had fired the shot that killed Cootie. Instead, her legal defense centered on a claim of self-defense, invoking Louisiana's so-called stand your ground law, a legal doctrine that has become one of the most contentious and widely debated concepts in American criminal law over the past 2 decades. It's worth taking a moment to explain what stand your ground actually means under Louisiana law, because the doctrine is frequently misunderstood, both by the public and, as this case would later reveal, sometimes even by the courts applying it. Traditionally, self-defense law in most states included what's known as a duty to retreat, the idea that if a person could safely escape a threatening situation, they were legally required to do so before resorting to deadly force. Stand your ground. Laws remove that requirement in certain circumstances, allowing a person who reasonably believes they are in imminent danger of death or great bodily harm to use deadly force without first attempting to retreat, provided they are in a place they have a legal right to be. Giles's defense argued that Thomas Cootie had acted aggressively toward her vehicle during the confrontation, behavior that, her attorneys contended, justified her belief that she was in imminent danger and entitled her to the legal protections the stand your ground doctrine provides. It's a defense that hinges almost entirely on the specific instructions a jury receives about how to weigh that claim, and on whether the presumption of reasonable fear applies automatically or must be independently established by the defense. That distinction would prove to be the single most consequential issue in the entire case, not just at trial, but for years afterward. In January of 2022, more than 3 years after Thomas Cootie's death, a jury heard the case and rejected Giles's self-defense argument. They convicted her of second-degree murder and obstruction of justice. Under Louisiana law, a second-degree murder conviction carries a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, and the obstruction charge added an additional 30 years on top of that. For a time, it appeared the case was settled. Giles would spend the rest of her life in a Louisiana correctional facility. But the legal story didn't end there. Giles's defense team appealed the conviction, arguing that the jury instructions given at trial had improperly handled the stand-your-ground presumption. Specifically, the question of whether jurors were correctly told how the burden of proof worked when a defendant invokes that defense. This is a highly technical area of criminal procedure, but it matters enormously in practice. If a jury is told incorrectly who bears the burden of disproving a claimed presumption of reasonable fear, it can fundamentally change the outcome of a trial, even when the underlying facts of the case remain exactly the same. In June of 2025, the Louisiana Supreme Court agreed with Giles's appeal on this narrow but critical point. The court found that the jury instructions regarding the stand-your-ground presumption had been faulty, and as a result, it overturned her second-degree murder conviction. This is an outcome that surprises many people unfamiliar with the appellate process. The court was not declaring Giles innocent, or asserting that the shooting was justified. It was ruling that the trial process that led to her conviction had a legal defect serious enough to require the conviction to be vacated, pending a new trial where a properly instructed jury could reconsider the case. Importantly, the Louisiana Supreme Court's ruling was narrow in scope. While it vacated the murder conviction, it explicitly upheld Giles's other convictions, obstruction of justice and identity theft, meaning that even with the murder charge set aside pending retrial, she remained incarcerated on the strength of those remaining convictions. This is where the case stood as of May 12, 2026, when a Louisiana parole board convened to consider whether Giles should be released on parole for the obstruction and identity theft charges that were still standing. Parole hearings are, by design, forums where the impact of a crime on surviving family members is given significant weight, and this hearing was no exception. Thomas Cootie's father appeared before the board and testified against her release, describing her, according to the record, as an unremorseful sociopath. The board voted unanimously to deny her parole. As of that decision, Kayla Giles's legal situation remains in an unusual limbo, convicted and incarcerated on the obstruction and identity theft charges, but awaiting a potential retrial on the underlying murder charge that originally sent her to prison for life. It's a reminder that in the American legal system, a case rarely ends the moment a jury delivers its first verdict. Appeals, retrials, and parole hearings can extend a case's legal life for years, sometimes decades, after the crime itself. Beyond the legal technicalities, this case sits at the intersection of two issues that reach far beyond Kayla Giles and Thomas Cootie individually: the volatility of contested custody arrangements and the ongoing national debate over how self-defense laws should be applied and explained to juries. Family court professionals across the country continue to grapple with how to make custody exchanges genuinely safer, especially in relationships where conflict has escalated to the point of physical confrontation. And legal scholars continue to debate whether stand-your-ground laws, as written and as instructed to juries, strike the right balance between protecting genuine self-defense and preventing the doctrine from being invoked after the fact to justify violence that a reasonable jury would otherwise reject. What remains constant, regardless of how the legal proceedings ultimately resolve, is the fact that 2 children lost their father in a Walmart parking lot on what should have been their sister's birthday celebration, a loss that no appellate ruling, retrial, or parole decision can undo. If you are currently navigating a high-conflict custody situation, family law professionals strongly recommend using structured, supervised exchange services where available, and reaching out to local family court mediators or domestic violence resources if a co-parenting relationship begins to feel physically unsafe. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 4, Michelle Hale. June 2015. Baton Rouge, East Baton Rouge Parish, Louisiana. Poisoning cases occupy a strange and unsettling category within true crime. Unlike a shooting or a stabbing, where the cause of death is immediately, violently obvious, poisoning conceals itself inside the ordinary language of illness. A person doesn't collapse from an external wound. They simply get sick, and then sicker, and then they don't recover. It's a method of killing that relies entirely on medicine's own systems of trust, on doctors interpreting symptoms in good faith, on coroners categorizing deaths according to the most plausible natural explanation, and on grieving families having no reason to suspect anything other than what they've been told. This is the story of Michelle Hale, and of how one death that was accepted as natural for nearly a year finally came undone, not because of anything discovered at the time, but because of a second death, entirely different in nature, that forced investigators to look backward. In June of 2015, Damian Paul Skipper, the 41-year-old live-in boyfriend of Michelle Hale, became violently ill in their Baton Rouge home. According to the medical record at the time, his symptoms centered on severe abdominal distress, the kind of presentation that, on its own, can be consistent with any number of natural gastrointestinal or systemic illnesses. Skipper's condition deteriorated, and he ultimately died. Medical professionals and the coroner's office at the time attributed his death to natural causes tied to those abdominal complications. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it speaks to how difficult certain poisonings are to detect without a specific reason to look for them. Standard toxicology screening, particularly in cases where a death appears consistent with a plausible natural explanation, does not typically test for every conceivable toxic substance. Investigators and medical examiners work with finite resources and finite suspicion. Without a specific reason to test for an unusual poison, that poison can pass through the system entirely undetected. In 2015, there was nothing about Damian Skipper's death that gave anyone reason to look further. The case was closed. It remained closed for the better part of a year. The break in the case didn't come from any new development connected to Skipper at all. It came from an entirely separate tragedy involving a different person in Michelle Hale's life. In 2016, Hale's estranged husband, Arthur Knopflin Jr., went missing. What followed was the kind of investigation that immediately signals foul play in a way that Skipper's death never had. Knopflin's body was discovered, badly burned, inside a truck in New Orleans. There is nothing ambiguous about a body found burned inside a vehicle. It is, on its face, evidence of a violent, deliberate act, and it triggered an immediate homicide investigation. As investigators began working Knopflin's case, they inevitably began mapping out his connections, the people in his life, the relationships that might explain who would want him dead. That mapping led directly back to Michelle Hale, his estranged wife. And it was at this point that something almost procedural, but ultimately case-breaking, happened. As investigators built a fuller picture of Hale's history, they learned about the earlier death of Damian Skipper, her live-in boyfriend, less than a year prior, a death that had been quietly filed away as natural. Two suspicious deaths connected to the same person, occurring within roughly a year of each other, is precisely the kind of pattern that reopens closed investigations. East Baton Rouge investigators made the decision to go back and re-examine Skipper's case with fresh eyes, this time armed with a very specific question they hadn't had reason to ask before. Was there any possibility that his death had not been natural at all? Answering that question required an extraordinary step, the exhumation of Damian Skipper's body. Exhumation for forensic re-examination is one of the more somber and logistically complex procedures in death investigation. It requires court authorization, the cooperation of the family, who, in cases like this, are often being asked to relive their grief in service of a suspicion they may not have previously entertained. and a forensic pathology team capable of extracting meaningful toxicological evidence from remains that have already been buried for months. The results of that renewed toxicological screening were unambiguous. Investigators discovered lethal levels of barium acetate in Skipper's remains, a highly toxic chemical compound that has no business being present in a living person's system at any level, let alone a lethal one. Barium acetate poisoning produces symptoms that can closely mimic other gastrointestinal and systemic illnesses in its early stages, which helps explain why Skipper's death was so plausibly, if mistakenly, attributed to natural causes the first time around. But at the concentrations found in his exhumed remains, there was no natural explanation available. Damien Skipper had been systematically poisoned. With that finding, the case against Michelle Hale transformed from a suspicious pattern into an active homicide investigation. She was arrested and initially charged with first-degree murder, the most serious homicide charge available under Louisiana law, carrying with it the potential for capital punishment. As the case developed and moved through the legal process, prosecutors ultimately amended the charge. In December of 2022, more than 7 years after Damien Skipper's original death, and roughly 6 years after the exhumation that reopened the case, Michelle Hale was convicted of second-degree murder. Under Louisiana law, this conviction carries an automatic, non-negotiable consequence, a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without any possibility of parole. There is no judicial discretion involved in that sentencing outcome. A second-degree murder conviction in Louisiana removes any possibility of an alternative sentence. Hale did not accept the conviction quietly. She maintained her innocence throughout the trial and continued to do so afterward, launching what would become a multi-year appeals process, a common but often misunderstood feature of major criminal cases. Appeals in cases of this magnitude typically move through multiple layers of the state court system, with defense attorneys raising a range of arguments about evidentiary rulings, the handling of forensic testimony, and procedural questions from the original trial. That process finally reached its conclusion in April of 2026, when the Louisiana Supreme Court denied Hale's final appeal. With that ruling, every avenue of state-level appellate review had been exhausted, and her life sentence became permanently cemented. The legal system's final word on a case that had taken nearly 11 years, from Damien Skipper's original death in 2015 to the conclusion of Hale's appeals in 2026, to fully resolve. There's a broader lesson embedded in this case for anyone interested in how forensic science and death investigation actually function in practice, as opposed to how they're often portrayed on screen. Poisoning cases are notoriously difficult to detect precisely because they don't announce themselves the way other forms of violence do. Medical examiners and coroners operate under real constraints: time, funding, and the simple fact that they cannot test for every conceivable substance in every death that crosses their desks. It often takes an unrelated development, a pattern noticed almost by accident, or a family member's persistent suspicion to reopen a case that has already been closed and filed as natural. In this instance, it was the entirely separate and violent death of Arthur Knopflin Jr. that indirectly gave Damien Skipper's case the second look it needed. This case also underscores why exhumation, however difficult and painful for the families involved, remains an important tool in modern death investigation. Without that renewed toxicological analysis, the lethal barium acetate that ended Damien Skipper's life might never have been discovered at all, and his death would have remained permanently misclassified. If you have concerns about the circumstances surrounding the death of a loved one, know that requesting a second review of a case, even one long closed, is a legitimate and sometimes necessary step, and local district attorneys' offices and coroners can advise on the process for doing so. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 5, Brandy Holmes. January 1st, 2003. Blanchard, Caddo Parish, Louisiana. There are certain cases that don't just end with a conviction. They continue evolving in the courts for over a decade afterward, forcing the legal system to confront difficult questions about mental competency, culpability, and where the line falls between accountability and constitutional protection. This is the story of Brandy Holmes, one of the rare women in Louisiana's history to be sentenced to death, and the long legal journey that followed. The crime at the center of this case took place on New Year's Day, 2003, in Blanchard, a small community in Caddo Parish in the northwestern corner of Louisiana. Reverend Julian Brandon, 70 years old, and his wife, Alice, 68, were the kind of couple whose lives were woven into the fabric of their community, a pastor and his wife, the sort of people whose home might reasonably have been assumed to be a place of safety, not violence. That safety was shattered when Brandy Holmes and her boyfriend, Robert Coleman, targeted the Brandon home in a violent robbery. Home invasions carried out specifically to rob elderly or vulnerable residents represent one of the most cynical categories of violent crime. They rely on the assumption that older victims will be less able to resist or defend themselves, and they frequently escalate into lethal violence not because the perpetrators necessarily plan for it, but because confrontation with a homeowner during a robbery can turn deadly in an instant. That is precisely what happened inside the Brandon home. During the course of the robbery, Reverend Julian Brandon was shot and killed. His wife, Alice, was also shot, struck in the head, an injury catastrophic enough to leave her permanently disabled. She required round-the-clock clinical care for the rest of her life, a life that continued for 5 more years before she passed away in 2008, a death connected, in the broadest sense, to injuries she never recovered from. It's worth pausing on Alice Brandon's story specifically, because cases involving surviving victims of violent crime often receive far less attention than cases involving those who die at the scene, even though the aftermath for survivors and their families can stretch on for years, carrying its own profound and ongoing toll. Alice Brandon lived for half a decade after the attack that took her husband's life and permanently altered her own, requiring the kind of continuous medical care that reshapes not just a victim's life, but the lives of everyone responsible for that care. Her eventual passing in 2008 closed a chapter of suffering that had, in a very real sense, begun the moment Brandy Holmes and Robert Coleman entered her home. The investigation into the Brandon robbery homicide led relatively directly to Holmes and Coleman, and by 2006, the case had reached trial. A Caddo Parish jury found Brandy Holmes guilty of first-degree murder, and in the sentencing phase that followed, jurors made the decision to impose the death penalty. This made Holmes one of a small number of women in Louisiana's modern legal history to receive a capital sentence, a distinction that reflects just how rare death sentences for women remain within the American justice system generally, even in cases involving profound violence. But a death sentence, particularly one imposed on a woman with a complicated developmental and psychiatric history, is very rarely the final word in a case. What followed Holmes's 2006 conviction was nearly a decade of appellate litigation, centered largely on questions of mental competency and the fairness of the sentencing process itself. Holmes's defense team spent years building and presenting evidence regarding her cognitive and developmental history, specifically, evidence of severe fetal alcohol syndrome. Fetal alcohol syndrome is a permanent, irreversible condition caused by prenatal alcohol exposure, and in its more severe presentations, it can produce significant intellectual disability, impaired impulse control, difficulty understanding consequences, and a range of other cognitive impairments that persist throughout a person's life. Courts across the country have increasingly had to grapple with how conditions like this intersect with the legal standards for criminal responsibility and, critically, with the constitutional prohibitions against executing individuals whose intellectual disabilities meet certain legal thresholds. This isn't a fringe legal question. It sits at the heart of some of the most significant capital punishment jurisprudence in modern American law. The U.S. Supreme Court has held that executing individuals with intellectual disabilities violates the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment, but the practical application of that rule, determining, case by case, whether a specific individual's cognitive impairments meet the legal definition of intellectual disability, has produced enormously complex and contested litigation in courts across the country. Expert psychiatric testimony in these cases frequently conflicts, with different evaluators reaching different conclusions about the same defendant based on different testing methodologies, different interpretations of developmental history, and differing clinical judgments. That was precisely the terrain Holmes's case moved through for the better part of a decade. Extensive evidence of fetal alcohol syndrome and intellectual disability, presented alongside conflicting psychiatric expert testimony that made the case anything but straightforward for the courts reviewing it. Alongside the competency question, Holmes's appeals also raised concerns about constitutional errors that occurred during the original penalty phase of her trial. The specific portion of a capital trial where a jury decides not guilt or innocence, but whether a defendant convicted of a capital crime should receive death or life imprisonment. Errors during this phase, whether in the presentation of mitigating evidence, jury instructions, or other procedural safeguards, can be significant enough to require a sentence to be vacated even when the underlying conviction stands. In August of 2016, a full decade after her original conviction and death sentence, a judge ultimately ruled in Holmes's favor on these issues, vacating her death sentence on the combined grounds of mental incompetency and the constitutional errors identified during the penalty phase. This did not overturn her underlying conviction for first-degree murder. Holmes remained, and remains, legally responsible for her role in the deaths of Reverend Julian Brandon and, indirectly, Alice Brandon. What changed was the sentence itself. In place of execution, Holmes was re-sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This outcome reflects something important about how the American capital punishment system actually functions in practice, as distinct from how it's sometimes portrayed. Death sentences, once imposed, are subject to extensive appellate review specifically because of the finality and severity of the punishment. That review process can take years, even decades, and can result in a sentence being vacated long after the original trial concluded, without disturbing the underlying finding of guilt. For Brandy Holmes, that process ultimately meant a shift from death row to a life sentence at the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women, where she remains incarcerated today, with no possibility of ever being released. The Brandon family's experience with this case spans an extraordinary length of time, from the New Year's Day robbery in 2003 through Alice Brandon's 5 years of declining health and eventual passing in 2008, through Holmes's 2006 conviction and death sentence, and finally through a decade of appellate litigation that didn't reach its conclusion until 2016. For families of victims, this extended timeline is often one of the most difficult aspects of the justice system to endure. A case that feels resolved at trial can remain legally unresolved for years afterward, reopening grief and uncertainty each time a new appeal is filed or a new hearing is scheduled. This case also speaks to a broader conversation happening in courtrooms across the country about how the justice system should weigh developmental and cognitive disabilities in sentencing, particularly in capital cases. It's a conversation without easy answers, one that requires balancing accountability for genuinely devastating harm against the constitutional principle that certain individuals, because of cognitive impairments present since birth, cannot be held to the same standard of culpability as someone without those impairments. Reasonable people, including judges and psychiatric experts working the same case, can and do disagree about where that line falls. If this case raises questions for you about elder safety or home security, local law enforcement agencies across Louisiana offer home safety assessments specifically designed for elderly residents, and organizations focused on elder advocacy can provide additional resources for protecting vulnerable family members. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Case 6. Linda Kate Passaniti, 2010. Keithville, Caddo Parish, Louisiana. Not every homicide investigation begins at a crime scene. Some begin instead in the far less dramatic territory of bank statements, forged signatures and paperwork that doesn't quite add up. The slow, methodical unraveling of a financial crime that only later reveals itself to have a body at the center of it. This is the story of Linda Kate Passaniti, a case that stands as one of the more elaborate, greed-driven murder-for-hire plots in recent Louisiana history. At the center of this case was Ernest Luttrell, a 73-year-old retired pilot living in Keithville, a small community in Caddo Parish. Luttrell was Linda Kate Passaniti's stepfather, a family relationship that should have afforded him trust and protection, but which instead became the very foundation of the scheme that ultimately took his life. The plot against Ernest Luttrell did not begin with violence. It began with paperwork. According to the case record, Passaniti systematically used forged power of attorney documents, falsified wills, and fraudulent legal papers to gain control over her stepfather's finances and property. This kind of financial exploitation of elderly family members is unfortunately far more common than most people realize, and it's a category of crime that adult protective services agencies and elder law attorneys across the country actively work to identify and prevent. Power of attorney abuse in particular is considered one of the most dangerous forms of elder financial exploitation, precisely because a valid power of attorney document grants the holder legitimate legal authority to make financial decisions on another person's behalf, authority that once obtained through fraud can be used to drain accounts, transfer property, and reshape a victim's entire financial life with a veneer of legal legitimacy. Using these fraudulent instruments, Passaniti was able to systematically drain Luttrell's bank accounts and gain control of his valuable property. For a time, this financial exploitation likely proceeded exactly as she intended, quietly, without triggering the kind of scrutiny that a more obvious crime might invite. Financial fraud against elderly victims frequently goes undetected for extended periods specifically because it doesn't produce the immediate visible signs of a crime. No broken window, no missing person, nothing that would prompt a neighbor or passerby to call the police. It only becomes visible when someone with legitimate access to the victim's affairs starts asking why the numbers don't add up, or when the victim themselves begins to realize something is wrong. It was this second possibility that ultimately threatened Passaniti's scheme. As the fraudulent activity progressed, the risk that Ernest Luttrell himself might discover what was happening to his finances and take action to stop it, whether by revoking the power of attorney, alerting other family members, or contacting law enforcement, became a growing liability for Passaniti. Rather than allow that risk to materialize, she made the decision to eliminate it entirely, in the most permanent way possible. To carry out that decision, Passaniti hired a local hitman, Eric Crane. The introduction of a hired third party into a family financial fraud scheme represents an escalation that moves a case from the realm of white-collar crime into something far more severe. Murder-for-hire cases carry their own distinct legal framework, and they are treated by prosecutors as among the most serious and premeditated forms of homicide, precisely because they involve a level of planning, financial transaction, and coordination between multiple parties that spontaneous violence simply doesn't require. Crane confronted Ernest Luttrell at his Keithville residence and shot him to death, bringing a violent, sudden end to a scheme that had, up to that point, unfolded almost entirely on paper. The investigation that followed did not begin with the shooting itself, but rather grew out of the financial trail that Passaniti's fraudulent activity had left behind. Forged documents, falsified legal papers, and irregular financial transactions leave a record, one that forensic accountants and financial crimes investigators are specifically trained to trace. As investigators began working backward through Luttrell's finances, examining the power of attorney documents and property transfers that had occurred in the months and years before his death, a clear picture began to emerge of a coordinated, long-running scheme, one for which the shooting represented not the beginning of the crime, but its final, violent culmination. That financial trail ultimately led investigators to both Passaniti and Crane, and both were arrested and charged in connection with Luttrell's death. In 2013, a Caddo Parish jury heard the case against Linda Kate Passaniti and convicted her on all 5 counts brought against her: first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, forgery, and identity theft, among the charges. A conviction on all counts in a case this complex, spanning both a violent homicide and an extended financial fraud scheme, reflects the strength of the evidentiary trail investigators were able to assemble, connecting the forged documents directly to Passaniti, and in turn, connecting her financial motive directly to the murder-for-hire arrangement with Eric Crane. For the murder and conspiracy convictions, Passaniti received a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, the mandatory outcome under Louisiana law for a first-degree murder conviction of this nature. But the sentencing didn't stop there. On top of the life sentence, the court imposed an additional 60 years to run consecutively for the financial fraud charges. The forgery and identity theft counts connected to her systematic exploitation of her stepfather's finances. The consecutive nature of that additional sentence is worth understanding because it reflects a deliberate sentencing philosophy. A consecutive sentence, as opposed to a concurrent one, means that the additional 60 years does not run at the same time as the life sentence, but is added on top of it. In practical terms, because Passaniti was already sentenced to life without parole, the consecutive 60-year term functions largely as a statement from the court about the independent seriousness of the financial crimes themselves, a formal acknowledgement that the fraud against Ernest Luttrell was not merely a precursor to the murder, but a separate severe pattern of criminal conduct in its own right, deserving of its own substantial punishment. This case offers an unusually clear window into a category of crime that receives far less true crime attention than it deserves: elder financial exploitation, and the way it can, in its most extreme and rare cases, escalate into lethal violence when the person carrying out the fraud perceives the victim as a threat to the scheme's continuation. Adult protective services agencies across Louisiana and the country work to identify warning signs of this kind of exploitation before it reaches anywhere near this level of severity. Signs that can include sudden changes to a person's will or power of attorney documents, unusual financial transactions, a family member who becomes newly and exclusively involved in an elderly relative's financial affairs, or a previously independent elderly person becoming increasingly isolated from other family and friends. If you have concerns about the financial safety of an elderly parent, grandparent, or relative, elder law attorneys and local adult protective services offices can provide guidance on protective legal measures, including how to establish safeguards around power of attorney arrangements that make this kind of fraud significantly harder to carry out undetected. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed, so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Case 7. Yaeka Rochelle Black. September 24, 2021. Shreveport, Caddo Parish, Louisiana. Some cases are difficult to tell not because the facts are complicated, but because they are almost unbearably simple, and simplicity, in a case like this, is its own kind of horror. This is the story of Yaeka Rochelle Black, a mother whose actions on a single afternoon in Shreveport would leave one child gone, one child forever changed, and an entire community grappling with a tragedy that unfolded in full view of the public. The Cross Lake Bridge sits along Louisiana Highway 1 in Shreveport, a stretch of roadway that thousands of drivers cross every single day without a second thought. A mundane, functional piece of infrastructure connecting one part of the city to another. On September 24, 2021, it became the site of an act of violence against children so difficult to process that it drew attention far beyond Caddo Parish. Yaeka Rochelle Black drove her 2 young sons, 10-month-old Joshua and 5-year-old Elijah, to the bridge that day. What led up to that drive? What state of mind she may have been in, and what factors contributed to the events that followed are questions that would occupy psychiatric evaluators, attorneys, and the court for the better part of the next 2 years. But the actions themselves, as established by the investigation and subsequent legal proceedings, are stark. Black pulled her vehicle over on the bridge, carried her infant son and her 5-year-old son to the edge, and threw both children over the railing into the deep water below. It is difficult to overstate how rare and how uniquely disturbing filicide cases involving public infrastructure like a bridge are, even within the broader and already deeply painful category of parents who harm their own children. Unlike violence that occurs within the privacy of a home, this act took place in a location with the potential for witnesses, and it was, in fact, a passerby's observation that would prove critical to the outcome of the case. A boater on Cross Lake spotted something in the water below the bridge, 5-year-old Elijah, fighting to stay afloat after the fall. The boater's quick action in pulling the child from the water represents exactly the kind of split-second civilian intervention that, in cases like this, can be the difference between 2 tragedies in one. Elijah survived the fall. His younger brother did not have the same outcome. Rescue teams that responded to the scene located 10-month-old Joshua, but he was unresponsive, and he was pronounced dead at the scene. In the aftermath, Black did not remain at the bridge. She fled the immediate area, and what followed was a rapid, cross-state search for her. Law enforcement in Louisiana moved quickly to identify her vehicle and issue alerts to neighboring jurisdictions, and that coordinated response paid off relatively swiftly. Texas authorities apprehended Black at a rest stop near Wascom, just across the Louisiana-Texas border along Interstate 20, a corridor that connects Shreveport to East Texas and one that would have offered a fast, direct route out of the immediate search area had she not been intercepted. The swiftness of her apprehension meant that, unlike many cases that stretch on for months or years before an arrest is made, the criminal proceedings against Black were able to begin relatively soon after the crime itself. But that speed did not translate into a simple or quick resolution. Before the case could proceed to trial, Black underwent rigorous psychiatric evaluation to determine her competency to stand trial, a critical and constitutionally required step in any criminal case where a defendant's mental state raises legitimate questions about their capacity to understand the charges against them and participate meaningfully in their own defense. Competency evaluations are distinct from, and should not be confused with, an insanity defense. Competency to stand trial asks a narrower question. Can the defendant, at the time of trial, understand the nature of the proceedings against them and assist in their own defense? It says nothing about their mental state at the time of the offense itself, which is a separate legal question entirely. Evaluators appointed by the court conduct extensive clinical interviews, review medical and psychiatric history, and ultimately issue findings that the court relies on in deciding whether a case can proceed. Once Black was found competent to stand trial, one of the more unusual elements of this case emerged. Against the advice of legal professionals, she chose to exercise her constitutional right to represent herself. This right, known in legal terms as the right to proceed pro se, stems from the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling that a competent defendant has the constitutional authority to waive their right to counsel and represent themselves in criminal proceedings, even when doing so is, by almost any measure, against their own best interests. Judges are required to conduct a careful inquiry before allowing a defendant to proceed without an attorney, ensuring that the waiver of counsel is made knowingly and voluntarily, and that the defendant understands the serious risks involved in navigating a complex legal proceeding without professional legal training. Self-representation in a case of this magnitude is exceptionally rare, and it's rare for good reason. Criminal trials, particularly those involving the most serious charges a person can face, require navigating rules of evidence, procedural motions, jury selection strategy, and cross-examination technique, skills that take attorneys years of training and courtroom experience to develop. A defendant representing themselves is, in nearly every practical sense, at a significant disadvantage, regardless of how strongly they may believe in their own ability to advocate for themselves. Despite these challenges, the trial proceeded with Black representing herself, and in 2023, she was convicted of second-degree murder in connection with Joshua's death and attempted second-degree murder in connection with the attack on Elijah, who survived. Under Louisiana law, the second-degree murder conviction carried the mandatory sentence required by statute: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. On top of that mandatory life sentence, the court imposed an additional 50 years for the attempted second-degree murder conviction related to Elijah. The distinction in these two charges reflects an important element of how Louisiana law treats crimes against multiple victims in a single incident. Joshua's death resulted in a murder conviction. Elijah's survival meant that the charge connected to him was, instead, attempted murder, a separate offense with its own sentencing framework, but one that the court chose to impose consecutively, ensuring that Black's punishment reflected the harm done to both of her sons, not just the one who did not survive. Elijah Black's survival is, in the context of this case, the element that offers anything resembling hope amid an otherwise devastating story. A 5-year-old child who survived being thrown from a bridge into open water carries with him not just the physical experience of that day, but a psychological weight that extends far beyond the courtroom's resolution of the case. Child trauma specialists who work with survivors of this kind of experience emphasize that recovery is a long-term process, one that extends well past any single moment of rescue or any legal conviction, and one that typically requires sustained, specialized therapeutic support extending through childhood and often into adulthood. This case, difficult as it is, also touches on a broader and often underdiscussed issue: the intersection of untreated or unaddressed severe maternal mental health crises and the safety of children. Postpartum psychiatric conditions, when severe and unaddressed, can, in the rarest and most extreme circumstances, escalate to the point of posing a genuine danger to children, a reality that maternal mental health advocates have worked for years to bring into public awareness, specifically because stigma and lack of access to psychiatric care can prevent mothers in crisis from receiving help before a situation becomes catastrophic. This is not offered as an excuse or a mitigating explanation for what happened to Joshua and Elijah Black. The court's competency findings and conviction reflect the legal system's determination that Black was criminally responsible for her actions. But cases like this one are part of why organizations focused on maternal mental health continue to advocate for expanded access to psychiatric screening and crisis intervention resources for mothers, particularly in the postpartum period, when risk factors for severe mental health crises are elevated. If you or someone you know is struggling with thoughts of harming yourself or a child in your care, please know that crisis resources exist and are available immediately, including the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, which can connect callers with trained crisis counselors any hour of the day. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 8. Camethea Coleman. November 23, 2010. Shreveport, Caddo Parish, Louisiana. Some criminal cases are ultimately decided not by eyewitness testimony or confession, but by the quiet, methodical work of forensic investigators reading a crime scene the way a detective reads a story, noticing what is present, and just as importantly, noticing what is conspicuously absent. This is the story of Camethea Coleman, and of how a fabricated account of a home invasion unraveled under the weight of physical evidence that simply didn't support it. U.S. Air Force Staff Sergeant Brian Spinks was 29 years old, a member of the military stationed in the Shreveport area, and the boyfriend of Camethea Coleman. On November 23, 2010, inside a residence in Shreveport, Spinks lost his life in an attack of extraordinary violence and intensity. The nature of the attack itself, as later established by forensic and medical evidence, reflected a level of violence that investigators and prosecutors would describe as consistent with an assault driven by deep personal rage rather than a calculated, dispassionate act. Spinks suffered more than 60 stab wounds across his upper body, along with a fatal wound to his throat. Forensic pathologists who study patterns of injury in cases like this often distinguish between wounds that reflect a single, lethal act and wounds that reflect what's sometimes referred to as overkill, repeated, excessive injury far beyond what would be necessary to cause death, a pattern frequently associated with attacks rooted in intense emotional escalation, jealousy, or long-simmering interpersonal conflict rather than premeditated, methodical violence. In the immediate aftermath, Camethea Coleman presented law enforcement with an account that, on its face, described her and Spinks as co-victims of a home invasion. According to the story she gave responding officers, a masked intruder had broken into the home, attacked both her and Spinks, and then fled before police arrived. To support this account, Coleman had inflicted a minor cut on her own arm, an injury seemingly intended to corroborate her claim that she, too, had been attacked by the intruder she described. This kind of staged victimization, where a perpetrator inflicts minor injuries on themselves in an attempt to appear as a fellow victim rather than the person responsible for the crime, is a pattern that homicide investigators are specifically trained to recognize and scrutinize. It requires a careful, comparative forensic analysis, examining the nature, depth, and pattern of the self-inflicted wound against the far more severe injuries suffered by the actual victim, and assessing whether the crime scene itself is consistent with the narrative being offered. In Coleman's case, that scrutiny quickly began to undermine her account. Investigators found no evidence of forced entry anywhere in the residence. No broken windows, no damaged door frames or locks, none of the physical indicators that would typically accompany a genuine home invasion by an unknown intruder. This absence is often one of the most significant details in cases like this, because it eliminates the most straightforward explanation for how an attacker could have gained access to a home, and it shifts investigative focus toward the possibility that whoever was responsible for the attack was already inside the residence with a legitimate reason to be there. Beyond the lack of forced entry, forensic teams analyzed the blood spatter patterns throughout the scene. Blood spatter analysis is a highly specialized forensic discipline that allows investigators to reconstruct key elements of how an attack unfolded, including the relative positions of the victim and attacker, the sequence and number of blows or strikes, and often, critically, whether the physical evidence is consistent or inconsistent with the suspect's account of events. In this case, investigators determined that the blood spatter patterns did not support Coleman's version of events involving an unknown, masked intruder. Perhaps most significantly, the self-inflicted wound on Coleman's own arm was examined and determined to be superficial, consistent with a minor, likely self-administered cut rather than an injury sustained during a genuine violent struggle with an intruder capable of inflicting more than 60 stab wounds on another person. The stark disparity between the severity of Spinks's injuries and the minor nature of Coleman's own wound became one of the clearest pieces of evidence undermining her narrative. Finally, forensic evidence connected the murder weapon directly and exclusively to Coleman, further eroding any plausibility to the intruder story she had presented to responding officers. Taken together, this body of forensic evidence painted an unambiguous picture for investigators. There had been no masked intruder. The narrative Coleman provided to police in the immediate aftermath of Spinks's death was, according to the case against her, a fabrication constructed to redirect suspicion away from herself and toward an invented third party. This case illustrates something important about how modern homicide investigations function, particularly in cases where a suspect attempts to reframe themselves as a victim. Physical evidence, the absence of forced entry, the specific patterns of blood spatter, the comparative severity of wounds, and forensic ballistics or weapon analysis often speaks with a consistency and objectivity that verbal accounts simply cannot match. A fabricated narrative might be internally coherent when first told to a responding officer in the chaos of an emergency call, but it must also be consistent with every piece of physical evidence at the scene, and that is an extraordinarily difficult standard for a fabricated story to meet under sustained forensic scrutiny. Coleman was ultimately charged in connection with Spinks's death, and the case proceeded to trial in 2012, roughly 2 years after the killing. A timeline that reflects the extensive forensic analysis required to build a case of this evidentiary complexity. A Caddo Parish jury heard the evidence, including the detailed forensic testimony regarding the lack of forced entry, the blood spatter analysis, and the disparity between Coleman's minor wound and Spinks's catastrophic injuries. The jury rejected her claims of self-defense and her attempt to attribute the killing to a third party, and convicted her of second-degree murder. As with the other second-degree murder convictions covered in this series, Louisiana law left no discretion in sentencing. Coleman received the mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Underlying this case, beneath its forensic details, is a story about domestic instability and jealousy that investigators and prosecutors identified as the driving force behind the attack. A reminder that intimate partner violence does not always look like a pattern of escalating warning signs recognized in advance. Sometimes, as in this case, it manifests as a single, catastrophic act of violence within a relationship that, from the outside, may not have presented obvious red flags to friends, family, or the broader community. Brian Spinks served his country as a member of the United States Air Force, and his death represents a loss felt not only by his family, but by the broader military community he was part of in the Shreveport area. Military families and service members experiencing relationship conflict have access to a range of support resources specifically designed for their circumstances, including military OneSource and installation-based family advocacy programs, which offer confidential counseling and crisis intervention services. If you are in a relationship where conflict has begun to feel unsafe, or you're concerned about a loved one's safety in their relationship, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is available to provide confidential support and can help connect individuals with local resources. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, Take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 9, Bunnock, Hannah, Landon. Culprit, Bunnock, Hannah, Landon. Date, April 25, 2023. Location, Harahan, Jefferson Parish, Louisiana. There are streets in Jefferson Parish that look like they belong on a postcard. Quiet cul-de-sacs, manicured lawns, basketball hoops bolted above garage doors. Harahan is the kind of place where neighbors know each other's names, where kids ride bikes until the streetlights come on, where nothing is supposed to happen. And for a long time, nothing did. That illusion of safety would not survive the spring of 2023. To understand what happened on April the 25th, you first have to understand the household at the center of it. Bella Fontanelle was 6 years old, bright-eyed, small for her age, the kind of child teachers describe as a joy to have in class. She split her time between 2 homes, as so many children in blended families do. Her father had moved on to a new relationship, and the woman he shared his household with was a woman named Bunnock Landon, known to friends and neighbors simply as Hannah. On the surface, there was nothing that marked Hannah Landon as dangerous. She wasn't a stranger. She wasn't someone Bella had reason to fear. She was, in the eyes of the child and the community around her, simply the woman who lived in the house. But behind closed doors, something had gone catastrophically wrong. On that April afternoon, inside the home the two of them shared, Hannah Landon turned on the 6-year-old girl in an act of violence that would leave an entire parish struggling to find words for it. Bella did not survive the attack. What investigators would later piece together painted a picture not of a single, impulsive loss of control, but of a sustained and merciless assault against a child who had no ability to defend herself. And then came the part of this case that separates it from almost anything else on record in Jefferson Parish's history, the part that turned neighborhood investigators into hardened veterans overnight. Hannah Landon did not call for help. She did not attempt to explain what had happened, or claim it was an accident, or run. Instead, in a sequence of actions that still defies easy explanation, she retrieved a large plastic chlorine bucket, the kind used for pool maintenance, and placed Bella's body inside it. She loaded that bucket onto a small pull wagon, the kind families used to haul groceries or beach gear. And then she walked. Home surveillance cameras up and down the block captured what happened next. A woman calmly pulling a wagon down a residential street in broad daylight, past driveways, past mailboxes, past the ordinary rhythms of a Tuesday afternoon. She walked with the composure of someone running an errand. Neighbors who later reviewed the footage described chills running down their spines. The sheer, almost surreal normalcy of the scene, set against what they now knew was inside that bucket. Her destination was not random. She walked directly to the home of Bella's biological mother, the woman who had given birth to Bella, raised her, loved her every day of her 6 years of life. And there, on that family's front lawn, Hannah Landon left the bucket. She turned around. She walked back the way she came. It would be Bella's own mother who made the discovery that no parent should ever have to make. The days that followed brought a wave of shock through Harahan and across Jefferson Parish. Vigils were held. Candles lined the sidewalk near Bella's home. Teachers from her elementary school spoke through tears about a little girl who loved to draw and who always wanted to help her classmates. The Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office moved quickly, and Hannah Landon was taken into custody within hours. The surveillance footage from a dozen different homes leaving investigators with an almost unbroken timeline of her movements. When the case reached trial, Landon's defense team pursued the only strategy available to them given the weight of the evidence, an insanity plea. They argued that their client had suffered a severe, unmedicated psychological break in the moments surrounding the attack, that the woman who calmly wheeled a wagon down a public street was not, in that moment, capable of understanding the nature of what she had done. It is worth pausing here, because this is where responsible journalism about violent crime has an obligation to the public. An insanity defense is not a loophole, and it is not employed lightly. Under Louisiana law, a defendant must prove they were unable to distinguish right from wrong at the time of the offense, a bar that is deliberately, intentionally difficult to clear. Court-appointed medical experts, independent of both the prosecution and the defense, were brought in to evaluate Landon's mental state, both at the time of the crime and at the time of trial. Their conclusion was unambiguous. Landon was found to be legally sane and fully competent to stand trial. Whatever psychological turmoil may have existed did not rise to the legal threshold that would have excused her actions. In 2025, a Jefferson Parish jury delivered its verdict, guilty of first-degree murder, and guilty on 2 additional counts of obstruction of justice tied to her transport and concealment of Bella's body. The obstruction charges mattered. They reflected the jury's recognition that what happened after the attack was not panic, but calculation. A choice to conceal. A choice to relocate evidence. A choice, prosecutors argued, to inflict one final act of cruelty on a grieving mother by delivering that bucket to her own front yard. Landon was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the murder, with an additional 80 years stacked on top for the obstruction charges. A sentence that, as the presiding judge noted at the hearing, ensures she will never again have the opportunity to be alone with a child. Every case in this series carries a story that extends beyond the courtroom, and Bella Fontanelle's does too. In the aftermath of her death, child advocacy groups across Louisiana used her case to push for expanded home safety check-ins for children in blended and non-parental caregiving households, a policy conversation that continues in the state legislature to this day. If there is one thing this case should leave you with, it's this. Children rely entirely on the adults around them to protect them, and when that trust is betrayed, the ripple effects reach an entire community. If you or someone you know is concerned about a child's safety, the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline is available 24 hours a day at 1-800-422-4453. Reporting a concern is never an overreaction. It can be the difference that saves a life. Bella Fontanelle was 6 years old. She deserved so much more time than she was given, and her story is told here so that it is never forgotten. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 10, Monique Kitts. Culprit, Monique Kitts, with hired. Accomplice Carl Michael Howard. Date, July 9, 2010. Location, Addis, West Baton Rouge. Parish, Louisiana. Every marriage has its private struggles, money troubles, long silences, the slow erosion of trust that so many couples fight quietly to repair. Most of the time, those struggles stay behind closed doors, resolved or endured, never making headlines. But in Addis, Louisiana, a small community along the west bank of the Mississippi River in West Baton Rouge Parish, one marriage's private struggles ended in a plot so cold, so calculated, that it would take investigators years to fully untangle it. Corey Kitts was 40 years old, a well-known and respected local businessman in a parish where everybody tends to know everybody. He was the kind of man neighbors wave to from their porches, someone active in the community, a familiar face at local establishments. By every outward appearance, his life, and his marriage to his wife, Monique, looked stable. It wasn't. On the morning of July the 9th, 2010, Corey Kitts was found in his own bed, in his own home, having been shot 3 times in the head and face while he slept. There was no forced entry, no signs of a struggle, just a peaceful home, a sleeping man, and a killer who knew exactly where to find him. In any homicide investigation, detectives look first and hardest at the people closest to the victim. Monique Kitts, as Corey's wife, was no exception. But on the surface, her position looked airtight. She had taken the couple's children out of the house that morning, meaning she was nowhere near the scene when the shots were fired. To a passing glance, it looked like the kind of alibi that clears a suspect fast that TOs seasoned investigators, though an alibi that is a little too clean is sometimes the first thread worth pulling. As detectives began digging into the Kitts' financial situation, a very different picture of the marriage began to emerge, one defined not by grief, but by mounting personal debt. Monique Kitts, investigators discovered, had been under significant financial strain in the months leading up to her husband's death. And there was one asset that stood to change everything. Corey held federal life insurance policies through his employment, with a combined value exceeding $500,000. A motive that large doesn't disappear, just because a suspect wasn't in the house when the trigger was pulled. It only raises a different question. Who was it? The investigation into Corey Kitt's death stretched on for years, methodically built piece by piece rather than solved in a single dramatic breakthrough. The reality of most homicide cases, however different that is from what television dramatizes. Detectives worked through cell phone tower data, mapping the movements and communications of everyone connected to the case in the days surrounding the shooting. They traced financial transactions, looking for any unusual transfers of money in the weeks before and after Corey's death. And they built relationships with informants and associates who, over time, became willing to talk. What emerged from that painstaking work was the outline of a murder-for-hire conspiracy. Investigators alleged that Monique Kitts had recruited a man named Carl Michael Howard to carry out the killing, with the understanding that he would be compensated using a portion of the insurance payout once it was collected. The staged alibi, taking her children out of the home at precisely the right moment, wasn't coincidence. Prosecutors argued it was engineering, a carefully timed absence designed to put daylight between Monique and the crime scene, while Howard carried out the act inside. Cell tower pings placed Howard in the vicinity of the home at the time of the shooting. Financial records showed movement of funds consistent with payment for services rendered, and associates of both Monique and Howard, when finally persuaded to cooperate, corroborated the broader outline of the plan. By 2014, prosecutors had assembled enough evidence to bring both Monique Kitts and Carl Michael Howard to trial. The case against them centered on second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit second-degree murder, charges that, under Louisiana law, reflect a killing that, while not necessarily premeditated to the same legal standard as first-degree murder, was still intentional and knowing. The jury did not need long to reach its conclusion. Both defendants were convicted on all counts. Louisiana law is unambiguous when it comes to second-degree murder. Conviction carries a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, no judicial discretion, no room for negotiation at sentencing. Both Monique Kitts and Carl Michael Howard received that sentence, guaranteeing that neither will walk free again. What makes Corey Kitt's case such an instructive one for anyone interested in how justice actually gets served isn't shock value. It's persistence. There was no dramatic confession, no smoking gun recovered at the scene. What broke this case open was investigators refusing to accept a convenient alibi at face value, and the slow, unglamorous work of following the money and the phone records until the truth had nowhere left to hide. It's also a sober reminder of how insurance-motivated violence, while rare, represents one of the most calculated forms of domestic homicide, planned not in a moment of rage, but over weeks or months, with financial gain as the driving force. Advocacy organizations that work with families of homicide victims often point to cases like this one as evidence of why financial abuse and coercive control within relationships deserve to be taken seriously long before violence occurs. If you are concerned about your own safety or the safety of someone you know in a relationship marked by control, threats, or financial manipulation, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is available at 1-800-799-7233. Any hour of any day. Corey Kitts did not get to see his children grow up. He didn't get to grow old. But because investigators refused to let his case go cold, the truth eventually caught up with the people responsible. And that, in the end, is what justice looks like. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. 10 cases. 10 different parishes across Louisiana. 10 women whose names are now permanently tied to some of the darkest chapters in this state's criminal history. But if you've watched this entire documentary from the beginning, you've probably noticed something that connects almost every single one of these stories together. It's rarely a stranger in the shadows. It's the person sitting across the dinner table, the spouse, the partner, the caregiver, the person a victim trusted the most. That is, without question, the hardest truth in true crime. And it's exactly why cases like these deserve to be told carefully, thoroughly, and with respect for the people whose lives were taken. From Amy Hebert in Lafourche Parish to Monique Kitts in West Baton Rouge Parish, what you've heard today spans nearly 2 decades of Louisiana's legal history. Cases resolved through juries, through plea deals, through appeals that stretched on for years, and in more than one instance, through investigators who simply refused to let the file go cold. Some of these women were sentenced to death before their sentences were later reduced to life, without parole. Some were convicted decades after the crime occurred, only after new evidence or renewed scrutiny cracked a case wide open. And in every single one, the Louisiana justice system, parish by parish, jury by jury, worked to hold the people responsible accountable, even when it took years to get there. That is the through line of everything we cover here at Cold Case Hour. These documentaries are not made to sensationalize tragedy. They're made because every victim named in this video, Camille and Braxton Hebert, Callie and Aaron Burnett, Thomas Cootie Jr., Damian Skipper, Reverend Julian and Alice Brandon, Ernest Luttrell, Baby Joshua Black, Brian Spinks, Bella Fontanelle, and Corey Kitts, deserves to be remembered as more than a case file. They were sons, daughters, parents, partners, neighbors, people with names and mornings and favorite songs, whose lives were cut short by people who were supposed to protect them. If this documentary affected you, we'd encourage you to take a moment today. Check in on someone you love. If something in a relationship or a household feels wrong, don't wait for it to feel undeniable. Trust that instinct. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline is available anytime at 1-800-422-4453, and the National Domestic Violence Hotline can be reached at 1-800-799-7233. Reaching out is never an overreaction. Thank you for spending this time with us and sitting through these 10 stories with the seriousness they deserve. If you learned something today, or if one of these cases stayed with you, let us know in the comments which one affected you most. We read every single one. And if you haven't already, this is your last chance before we close out. Hit that subscribe button, tap the like on your way out, and we'll see you in the next investigation.